Two words come to mind when attempting to assess Denis Williams's contributions to Guyana's cultural landscape: polymath and pioneer. As the biographical note at the start of Prehistoric Guyana states, Denis Williams worked as an artist, art historian, novelist, anthropologist, and archaeologist on 3 continents. He put his intellectual powers, creative genius, and energy into a wide range of interrelated work in Britain, Nigeria, and Guyana. He was a true polymath. End quote. Given the scale and scope of his achievements, we will inevitably merely scratch the surface today. Even this introduction is a tour of highlights rather than a potted history. We have plans to review other aspects of his contribution to Guyana's cultural life early next year in the Samaan sessions. Denis Joseph Ivan Williams was born on the 1st of February 1923 in Georgetown to a Barbadian mother, Isabelle Adonis, and a Guyanese father, Joseph Alexander Williams, whose family came from Ithaca in Berbice. Isabella was a seamstress and occasional companion to expatriate wives. Joseph Alexander was a ship's purser on a ship that plied the waters of the Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice rivers. As he would later recall, his mother was the artist and painter in the family, with a mahogany box of paints with brass clips. As early as the age of 11, Williams attended art classes at Bishop's High School, organized by Golda White, whom we encountered in an earlier talk in the Samaan series about the Working People's Art class and its precursors. Interestingly, White was also from Barbados. She would establish the British Guiana Arts and Crafts Group in 1931. Williams would later exhibit work at their annual group exhibitions. Williams also benefited from the guidance provided by E.R. Burroughs, as did a young Aubrey Williams, whose work we considered at the beginning of this year. These early influences and institutions, fledgling and provisional as they were, probably had a profound influence on the young artist. As Williams would later write, painting and sculpture had no role in British plantation society, so painters and sculptors simply did not exist. Hence, at the beginning of the 20th century, few works of art were available as a basis for initiating any kind of movement in the visual arts in Guyana. Yet, within a single generation, such a movement had been born, and this had come to pass as a reflex, yet again, of British enterprise. The first Guyanese painters were sign artists using house paints to sell British products, and the first Guyanese sculptors were cabinet makers of British repro furniture using carpenter's tools. By way of illustration, Stanley Greaves, who will be speaking shortly, his father, I think, was a sign painter, and I believe that his grandfather was a cabinet maker. Williams won a British Council scholarship to the Camberwell School of Art in 1946 and lived in London for much of the next decade teaching art. He returned to Guyana briefly in 1949 to produce a series of paintings in oil on sacking, the plantation studies, origins, burden, and release, which were shown at private exhibitions and generated no little comment and some hostility. In 1950, he was to host a one-man show at a London gallery. In one of life's enduring ironies, its centerpiece, the painting Human World, was reproduced in Time magazine and bought by public subscription in British Guyana, which only months earlier had shunned his plantation studies. Denis showed an early awareness of the journey that lay ahead of him. In 1949, in an embryonic edition of the journal Kike Overall, he registered a protest against Guyana today, writing, and I quote, "Each day we die a little beneath the sun. By noon, the positive is scorched into a pointless neutral, and a whole population gasps, its heat turning dully on a still, sharp point. This is the first thing, the most important. We are still dominated by the sun, strangers in a land we call our own. There is no Guyanese people, only an accumulation of persons, end products of a various history. Here, patterns kill us, and the spiritual bullying of foreigners forever consent to the act. Incoherence, apishness, sentimentality, uncreativeness. We cling to a dream of a very negative quality. The person in Guyana looks outward. The things we have all brought with us still remain potential. There has been no marriage, consequently, no issue. Out of the complex of influences within and without." End quote. Williams spent 10 years in Britain and then 10 years in Africa, 5 in Sudan, lecturing in fine arts and history, and 5 in Nigeria. It was in Sudan that his interest in archaeology was awakened. The sojourn in Nigeria produced the pioneering Icon and Image, a study of sacred and secular forms of African classical art. He also set up museum collections of African artifacts at both, and forgive my pronunciation here, I think it's Ife and Lagos, the 2 universities in Nigeria, and edited journals of African studies. Returning to Guyana in 1968, Williams went to live in Asano in the Mazaruni region for the first 6 years, writing, painting, and researching indigenous art forms, particularly petroglyphs. He also painted a triptych for a new church in Camarang. In the mid-1970s, Williams became the director of art. In 1976, he founded and became the principal of the Burroughs School of Art, an institution that survives today. He painted a mural at the newly opened Cultural Centre on Homestretch Avenue, and a few years later would set up and serve as director of the Walter Roth Museum of Anthropology, which also survives today. He also started and contributed to the journal Archaeology and Anthropology, which I think, I stand to be corrected, is in need of resuscitation. In 1980, he began extensive archaeological work in the northwest region of Guyana. Shortly before his death, he completed work on prehistoric Guyana. This was a comprehensive reconstruction of the history and characteristics of human settlement of the Guyanas. In her foreword, Betty Meggers noted that Williams brought 3 particular qualities to his research: a holistic approach, a rare combination of scientific judgment and artistic insight, and perhaps most refreshingly, a unique perspective. She writes, and I quote, "Not having been formally trained in any of the disciplines involved, he has escaped indoctrination by establishment position." From a Guyanese point of view, there is one other aspect that merits particular attention. In this final oeuvre, as in earlier undertakings, Williams was claiming intellectual terrain traditionally reserved for foreigners. This was the first time that a Guyanese had attempted to grapple with and piece together the region's prehistory. It was a huge step for local scholarship. It also mirrors and echoes roughly contemporaneous work by Wilson Harris in the field of literature, Aubrey Williams, Stanley Greaves, Stephanie Correa, and others in the field of art, Martin Carter, Mahadai Das in the field of poetry, to stretch language and the visual arts into forms better suited to representing the multiple and shifting layers of a Guyanese perspective. No doubt scholars like Professor Vibe at Cambridge and Al Crichton at UG could identify a similar thrust in the spheres of music and theatre. Williams acknowledged early on the significance of the calypso, for example, but felt that it was too slim a cultural artifact for the burden of our various history. And in that 1949 protest piece in Kike, Williams had indeed discerned the halting emergence of what he called a Guyanese pattern. At this stage, in his estimation, it was a prostrate, frustrated something, lying beetle-like on its back, awaiting the touch of the interested hand. What Williams identified as a pattern, I will treat as a process. This process of articulating a Guyanese perspective was a messy one, occurring across time and space, stubbornly diffuse, with no obvious center or governing philosophy. Williams called these incoherent shiftings. They emerged in fits and starts, with false turnings and dead ends. There was no neatly plotted arc. The process registered decay and decline as much as it did birth and hope. Some scholars have framed bits of the process as talking back to empire. Absent any broad-based study of the process, I'd hypothesize that it was more about creating a new voice, using some of the tools of empire, and, if I may risk a metaphorical mashup, birthing a polyphonic perspective where parts of the whole are continually speaking to each other, past each other, colliding and synthesizing. In terms of its possibilities, no one embodies the process better, perhaps, than Denis Williams. And to return to his words, Guyanese man who has all the atavisms in his blood is a microcosm, capable of fashioning the universal. Beneath this sun walks the man who is all races of the earth. His hope is founded on marriage, his home, the world. In that sense, he was a prophet, perhaps, as well as a pioneer. Williams was married twice, to Catherine Hughes in 1949 and to Toni Marion Dixon in 1975, and I believe she's on the call. Jennifer Wishart was his companion in his later years, and he fathered 11 children, some of whom are also on the call, 5 from each marriage and 1 with Jennifer. Several of his children and relatives are on the call. We welcome them and acknowledge their efforts over the years to collate his work and memorialize him. It seemed appropriate to ask 2 practitioners who knew Denis Williams well to help to contextualize his work as an artist and an archaeologist. We will turn first to Stanley Greaves, who was a friend and contemporary, to speak a little about his art. And then to Professor Mark Plew, who is an emeritus professor of anthropology at, and forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce that. Is it Boise State University?
Boise State.
Yeah, Boise State University, and author of The Archaeology of Guyana, published in 2005.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak on the, to make some comments rather on the painting, Human World. The painting was completed in 1950. Dimensions 60 inches by 52. And as mentioned before, it was on the Time magazine cover, which created some great interest among us in Guyana to see him there on that cover, because the only other artist in the Caribbean who appeared on that cover at the time would have been from Cuba. The media, he used a mixture of oils and tempera. The tempera is really an oil painting technique from the Renaissance before the creation of oil painting. The powdered pigment is usually mixed with the yolk of the egg. I used to think that it was the white of the egg, but it's the yolk of the egg. And the colors have to be mixed fresh. Every day that you paint, you use up that amount of pigment. It dries very well, dries very hard, and as it's drying, it creates a chemical reaction between the yolk of the egg and the pigment, which bonds and creates a very permanent surface. Williams used a mixture here of tempera and oils. The underpainting, the underpainting would have been done in tempera, and over that, oil would have been applied wherever necessary. It was Wilson Harris who, on a visit to Guyana, suggested that the painting should be acquired by Guyanese. The challenge was taken up by Dr. Frank Williams, who was a collector of art, a supporter of art, and also by David Ford, a very respected senior civil servant. And so between them, they were able to raise funds, public funds, in order to acquire the painting. It arrived in 1956 in Guyana, sent to the art room, Queen's College, where Burroughs was teaching. And it was a Sunday morning when the crate was opened. Both Michael Leela, former student of Burroughs, who also joined the Working People's Art class, Michael Leela, myself, Burroughs, and David Ford were there when the crate was opened up. Both Leela and I, our first reaction was the size of the painting. That caught our attention, first of all, before we began looking at what was the theme being explored. The work was highly recognized in Britain, and both Henry Moore and Wyndham Lewis, fine artists, both commended highly on the work of Denis Williams. There was some objection from Denis, because at the time he was being categorized as a Negro artist. Exotic, those are the terms that were being applied. Terms which are still applied up to this day when they talk about Black art and Black artists. The work itself, located in the UK, as we can see, the composition is virtually taken over by the figures, figurative composition, slight reference to the sky at the background, and being in the background of the skyline, it helps to create a sense of space between the figures, which are very up front, and the buildings behind. We notice the outline factories and hands appearing from the sky. The factories suggest both the industrialization of Britain, and also suggests the birth of the Industrial Revolution. Factories manufacturing, clouds of smoke pouring out from the chimneys. The hands, I feel, suggest the hands of the workers who had to work on the very difficult conditions. The painting itself was based on a photograph that was taken of Denis and his wife, Katie Alice, walking on the pavement. Denis was pushing a pram with his baby child in it. Now, the central figure was supposed to originally be a portrait of Denis himself, but it was changed, became that female figure. The figure on the right is a portrait of his wife. There are three figures that caught my attention, the three figures in the forefront of the composition. The central figure, I feel, that seems out of time due to her costume, strange costume she's wearing. The central figure of me seems to represent the matriarchal figure. The foundation of ancient societies is matriarchal. The child that she is pushing in the pram, in my mind, represents future generations of the immigrant population in Britain. The figure on the left held my attention for quite a while, myself and Michael, and came to the conclusion that that figure was like the Obeah man, the spiritual worker in Guyana. From the costume that he's wearing, he's not wearing a modern costume, and also some sort of necklace around his neck, some sort of ornament around his neck and around his head as well. What I found curious was that the figure was looking away from the audience, unlike the other visual people who are looking at it, because that figure to me suggested that it was a kind of shaman, obeah who is a protective spirit for the immigrants, the other people in the composition. That was my feeling. The faces in the background are strange because it's a mix. It's not realistic. It's more naturalistic. They resemble human faces, but at the same time, I thought that they had a mask-like appearance. The difference would be that figure on the far right, with his cap and the spectacles, realistic, like the figure of Denis's wife, and to some extent the figure of the shaman. There is another figure to the left of the shaman, which seems to be some sort of spirit being looking on at what is going on. The parade of figures also suggests the influx of immigrants into Britain in the 1950s. Denis himself felt during that period, which saw the opening of the Korean War, that he might have been and asked to enter into the army, but that did not take place. We found it hard at first to relate to what was going on in the painting, because it definitely did not have anything to do with Guyana, but it certainly has something to say about the mass immigration into Britain after the Second World War. The actual use of pigment, of color in the painting, it has nothing to do with what is sometimes called Caribbean color. And that is something I take umbrage about, Caribbean color, because I found that the colors in Britain in autumn were exceedingly bright. It's right up in your face. And also the colors on the moors in northern England. Anyway, the painting has a restrictive palette. It's almost, not quite, it's almost monochromatic. It's more restrictive because we see dabs of color like red, tints of green, the ochres. It's mostly painted in a base of browns, of ochre, browns, burnt umber, burnt sienna, the brown range. And the touches of green and the tints of blues, of course, would be the opposites of those colors, of the brown colors. The yellows bring a bit of light, and the white, of course. Those white highlights really make those figures stand out, as well as the white highlights in the background, the hands in the sky. The figure in Guyana did not attract, the painting there did not attract all that amount of attention because of the subject matter. The subject matter was foreign to us, but we all admired the painting, the sense of painting, of the skill in the use of colors, as well as his sense of composition. Otherwise than that, the painting, when it arrived, we thought it sort of cemented the national collection. The national collection had already been started from exhibitions that took place annually. But with the advent of this painting, it seemed to form a focus, even though the subject matter was not Guyanese. It seemed to form a focus for the national collection, and also given an impulse to the further collection of works by Guyanese and by Guyanese artists. I actually chose this painting because of the time when it arrived in Guyana and became a focus to the national collection. But of course, the work that really refers to Guyana would be the work in the mural that he painted in the cultural center, in which he did use tempera. And I used to visit him at nights to see him at work, mixing his paints and applying it after that. But that work itself, I think, requires a separate commentary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Stanley. Professor Plew, would you like to take over?
Thank you. A number of years ago, after Denis's passing, I was asked to edit and prepare Prehistoric Guyana for publication. this incredibly important work. And during the time that I was doing that, I received a note from Denis's young daughter, Kibby, asking me if I thought that in some way her father's art and his writing had influenced his archaeology. And I thought about that, knowing that Denis had not been formally trained, and to the quote that Isabelle was reading from Betty Megger's introduction to that book. I thought about it, and I wrote her back, and I said, I'm certain that that was the case. Denis had this ability to, in a very creative way, think beyond the boundaries, as Meggers had put it, in regard to the way in which archaeologists think typically in a very scientific way about a number of matters. Yet at the same time, Denis was incredibly well-read. He was an avid reader. He was fully aware of the current literature, particularly in North America, which I thought was interesting. But without question, I believe that his artistic turns clearly influenced the way he thought about a number of problems and issues in archaeology. You know, his contributions are formidable, and I can only hope to very briefly mention some of them here. You know, among his early interests, not surprisingly, is his interest in rock art. And of course, that includes his work at Aishalton. His master's research, of course, at Aishalton really has become the most extensive and continuing the most important rock art study that has been completed in Guyana. There are three notable contributions that he made in that regard that I want to mention briefly. One of them is his argument that the rock art at Aishalton was, in a way, what we might refer to as signing. He believed that there were elements that occurred in different combinations and in different directional orientations that identified locations of raw materials, identified the ranges of animals, and perhaps distributions of plant materials. That's something that no one had really thought very much about or thought at all about at that point in time. One of the things that I thought was incredibly interesting about his work at Aishalton was that he conducted excavations near many of the boulders containing the petroglyphs. Many of you have perhaps seen the Aishalton rock arts, broad field, many granitic boulders. Denis did something that no one had thought to do at all, which was to excavate by those boulders, looking to see if he could recover the tools that had actually been used to produce them. And when I first read this, I thought that's really curious, and I was unaware of any other attempt by anyone, including in North America, to have done that. To my knowledge, I don't think it's happened since that time. Out of that comes one of the things that I think is often forgotten about his work at Aishalton, which is the creation of kind of an early chipstone typology for Guyana and that region. One of the other things that came out of his work at Aishalton, and you see it popping up in his work in other areas in Guyana, is his recognition or his argument that rock art was very likely produced by shamans. Denis, by virtue of that extensive reading, had encountered the work of Rachel Dolmatov, who was a Colombian anthropologist who worked with indigenous groups who used hallucinogens in the process of producing rock art. Denis picked up on that very quickly and wrote about it in a number of his papers. Out of the work at Aishalton, and I mentioned the fact that I think there's an early sort of lithic technology that emerges there. At the same time, Denis really develops what's kind of the first, as we would think about it, chronology of Guyana archaeology. It's interesting to see how he was thinking about a number of things. And I can see that some of my belief were, in fact, probably framed a little bit about his thinking in terms of indigenous art, including in Africa. Out of all of that comes his publication of very important work that still remains one of the most formidable pieces of rock art research in the region. 1979, he publishes Petroglyphs in the Prehistory of Northern Amazon and the Antilles. This is an incredible work published in World Archaeology and continues to be just so incredibly important to those interested in that particular study. You know, beyond the work in Aishalton, Denis Williams began to work conducting surveys and archaeological test excavation at a number of locations in Berbice, along the Mazaruni, the Essequibo. He did work in the Rupununi, of course. A lot of that, in fairness, was building upon some of the work that I think Meggers had done in a very different level in the early 1950s. But he was doing it in a very different way, an eye to much greater detail, very interested in building upon and fleshing out and broadening our understanding of Guyanese prehistory. One of the things that he did during that period of time occurred in its report was published or prepared rather in 1979, was a survey of Irakrama. He was contracted to survey the area, a massive undertaking, and I remain surprised and impressed at what he was able to do in that context. He identified a broad range of sites and adaptations in that area, including the documentation of the emergence of agriculturalists by about 3,500 years ago, quite notable. The paper that he produced, it's a rather large volume. It's a contract report. It's one of his finest pieces of work from my point of view. It's incredibly detailed, very well written, and it's a shame that it was never fully published. One of the things about Denis Williams is that, unlike most regional archaeologists in the period, Williams recognized and understood just how important paleo-environmental research is. He understood that our ability as archaeologists to understand prey choice shifts over time, to see changing constellations and plant communities, was entirely predicated upon our ability to understand the past environments to which people were adapting. And he spent a good deal of his time working in those areas. He's utilizing, obviously, or was utilizing a lot of palynological pollen studies by a number of people that have worked in Guyana in the surrounding area to create some of that sort of backdrop to the work that he was doing, particularly in terms of the shell middens in the Northwest. He continued his research and interest in research in rock art, however, and developed what I've sometimes referred to as kind of fisheries management strategy, along the lines of how he thought about signing with the petroglyphs at Aishalton. He argued that there were petroglyphs that had been, some of you may be familiar with the fish trap petroglyphs that Denis often spoke of in terms of the forest. He believed that there were petroglyphs that were used to sign the presence of different species on a seasonal basis, and also to use certain technologies or the best technologies to acquire them. Very interesting kind of approach. But among the many things that Denis was exposed to or exploring over the course of his many years of research and archaeology, I think of the shell middens. He never lost his interest in that. As all of you probably are aware, there's a long history of explorations there, 150 years of less than systematic work. Denis is the first person to take that on in a much more scientific way. He's the first to conduct formal excavations, systematic excavations at Barabina, Paraka, Kavakaburi. And he's the first person to take that. And you see a lot of this at the grand scale, looking at the totality of the prehistory of Guyana in prehistoric Guyana. But he's beginning to develop a regional synthesis of how all the shell middens and those activities are interrelated and how they're changing over time. In that context, he also recognized, and along this line of thinking that you have to understand something about the paleo environment, he realized the coastline of Guyana was in ebb and flow over several thousands of years, beginning at the end of the Pleistocene into the early Holocene period. And he recognized that that was a means by which he could begin to better understand the nature of what the shell midden dwellers were engaged in terms of their subsistence. One of the things that he was able to do in that regard was to recognize temporal changes related to environmental changes in terms of the presence and absence of different species that were either related to or associated with salt or brackish waters and fresh waters. That kind of research was not being done at all in the Guyanas generally during the period of time that Denis was working in the shell middens. And another good example of this is something that no one in the region generally, in the northern Amazon or the Guyanas, is doing at all during this period of time, although it's becoming more common in Europe and in North America. He was calculating the nutritional values of different species. In this particular instance, a focus on shellfish. as a means by which he could begin to think about the variable resource productivity of the resources that were being utilized. As has been noted here, Dr. Williams worked to a great extent anyway, in a scholarly isolation, avoiding the time that he spent at the Smithsonian. But he was a avid reader, and he used many current analytical frameworks that were, as I've said just a moment ago, not common in the Amazon and the Caribbean areas at all. The last thing I'd mention in terms of the work with the mounds, the shell middens, is work that he did at Barabina. Denis is the first archaeologist working in Guyana to have systematically returned to the same locations on more than one occasion. There are multiple field seasons in order to really be able to understand the totality of the expressions of these prehistoric inhabitants and habitations. One has to do that. He's the first to do that. Out of that comes his recognition that an argument that the earliest agriculture probably occurred much earlier than we had thought. Denis is sort of arguing that it may have occurred as early as about 6,000 years ago. And it's curious that now the most recent work in Guyana is, in fact, strongly in support of that. But when thinking about the contributions of Denis Williams, and this has been touched on, I think, by Isabelle, but I want to repeat it here. You've got to look beyond, his archaeological work. Denis Williams, as described here, is a pioneer, and a pioneer clearly in areas that I know far less about than archaeology. But people who are pioneers and who are dedicated, like people like Denis Williams, understand that it is left to them to do more than just the research alone. That there's an infrastructure that has to follow from what we do, that has to be able to perpetuate itself over time. And in that context, Denis always wanted, and we had conversations about it, was very much interested in establishing what he always referred to as a registry of archaeological sites, of archaeological properties. He was very interested in and understood, I think, that over time, down the road, so to speak, that it would be necessary to have something of a structure that would guide what was done in terms of Guyanese archaeology, who did it, when it was done, how it was reported, how it was preserved. And in that context, beyond kind of the beginnings of a registry, and as has been mentioned, he understood there has to be some means by which these materials are maintained. And his role in establishing the Walderoth Museum of Anthropology is a great example of that. He understood as well the need to be able to see the results of his researches and potentially others down the road, that there had to be a means by which that could be disseminated. Hence, archaeology and anthropology, which in fact is still being published. Currently, it's online and an open access journal, and reporting a good deal about archaeology. It is, of course, importantly, and this, I think, is many of you know that, all of you know this, it was the first English language journal in the Caribbean. One thing I'd say about Denis's publishing, too, is that while he published formally, scientifically, and some of his work is really quite phenomenal, at the same time, I think he understood that there are multiple audiences that we have. There's a public audience. And some of the things that Denis did in terms of public talks, and some of his public writing, Pages in Guyanese Prehistory as an example of that, is sort of directed more toward a public community audience. I think that's important. Lastly, I'd say that one of the things that pioneers like Denis, people as dedicated as I believe he was, almost always do, and he did this, is to support the training, providing training and support of students and others interested in the same pursuit. There are many of them. Many of you would know them: George Mentor, Terry Ruppername, George Simon, of course, Jenny Wishart, and Denis's support with Jenny of the Junior Archaeology Program. I'd close this by just saying that, Denis, like all archaeologists, I think historically, built upon the work that others had done, but he did it systematically in a way that no one else ever had. He's really Guyana's first archaeologist in the truest sense of it. He did all the things that you need to do. He did them in a very contemporary and current way. He was a good thinker about so many things in a scientific fashion, but at the same time, I think never lost sight of that sort of creativity that I think he always brought to the way in which he thought about a number of archaeological problems. A dedicated field worker, dedicated writer, dedicated to the cause. Louisa Daggers, Guyana's young upcoming archaeologist who's going to carry on this tradition. And I have often spoken of Denis in regard to our belief that there's nothing archaeological that doesn't have Denis's fingerprint upon it. Thank you.